Hello and welcome back to another entry in our unit guide for bolt action, and today we are going to be continuing to work our way up that high explosive weapon profile and take a look at the medium howitzer. Now, in our previous video, we introduced ourselves to the howitzer weapon profile by of course taking a look at the light howitzer and going over the numerous ways it can be utilized on the battlefield. And this video isn't going to be too much different from the previous one, as the medium howitzer is more or less just an upgun version of the tool that we are already now familiar with. But let's go ahead and start breaking down the medium howitzer and seeing what it has to offer. And first up here, much like the anti-tank guns, the medium variant of the medium howitzer is going to be coming in at 75 points, should you take it as a regular experience unit, and it will have a 4-man crew. And should this crew drop down to just 1 man, you will suffer a -1 to hit and a -1 to morale, as you do with every artillery piece. But fortunately, many of these howitzers do have a gun shield upgrade on it, which of course is going to give your opponent a -1 to wound these models if they are attacking them with small arms fire. I will say this, however, if you do have the option to run your medium howitzer without a gun shield, it's something I would consider doing to save 5 points, something we will touch on again later when we discuss the strategies of using a medium howitzer. But as is the case with all other artillery pieces, the medium howitzer is also going to have the fixed keyword, which means taking an advance order will allow you to pivot this weapon and suffer a -1 to hit, and a run order is going to allow the crew to relocate this weapon up to 6 inches, so we are not totally immobile despite the size of this weapon. But after that, the medium howitzer is of course going to have the howitzer keyword, allowing it to fire both directly and indirectly, provided that it can draw line of sight to its intended target. And that also means that most medium howitzers are going to have the option to take a spotter, which will be plus 10 points on the unit's overall cost, but it will give them a secondary line of sight to draw from, something I dismissed in my previous light howitzer video. But when it comes to looking at medium howitzers as an artillery piece, I will reconsider it a bit here. And once again, this is something that will come up when we start talking about the strategies behind using a medium howitzer. But let's finally get along and take a look at the howitzer profile itself. And that's going to kick off with a 60-inch range when using direct fire, and a minimum 30-inch range with a maximum 72-inch range when using indirect, which is a whole lot of reach for a 75-point unit. However, you're really going to need to be careful here when picking your targets, as the medium howitzers are not going to be able to hit enemies with indirect fire if they are within 2.5 feet, which is a pretty large bubble. And of course, in bolt action, you are not allowed to pre-measure your distance, so if you select a target and it turns out it's within your minimum range, and that's going to require players to really learn their distances and get good at gauging them on the tabletop. But of course, the medium howitzer is going to be a single-shot weapon, representing their high-caliber, breech-loaded nature, which is always a bit of a gambit in bolt action with how many hit modifiers we have. But like I mentioned in the light howitzer video, being able to indirect fire or target buildings directly gives you much better chances to land hits than other standard single-shot weapons would. Meanwhile, for the penetration value, it is going to say HE, meaning you will reference the high explosive chart for your penetration value, which in this scenario is going to be HE 3 inches, meaning you will have a penetration value of 3, and once again, that penetration value is not going to drop off over long range, as HE shells don't rely on velocity to penetrate their enemy's armor, but instead the explosive payload of their warhead. And that +3 penetration at 60-inch range means the medium howitzer is going to be a pretty decent vehicle counter, at least against soft-skinned targets or light armored vehicles, as it will be hitting on par with the light anti-tank gun at longer ranges. It will also mean that you're going to be wounding any infantry that you would hit on a roll of 2+, with the only exception being the veteran Soviet assault engineers who have body armor, but even they will be dying on a pretty reliable 3+ roll. But let's go ahead and take a look at what the rest of that 3-inch HE profile entails. And first of all, as its naming would suggest, you are going to have a 3-inch high explosive template, which really doesn't have too much trouble covering half a squad, and can sometimes even get more if they're bunched up in one area. So if you're on the receiving end of a high explosive medium howitzer profile, it would be best advised to take a down order, otherwise you will very likely be making a morale check as your unit reaches half strength. However, while the weapon's template size does increase, unfortunately the amount of pins applied by the medium howitzer do not, as it still will be applying the same D3 pins that we saw on the light howitzer profile, which honestly isn't all that much of a drawback. D3 pins is still very good to apply to a unit who just had half its models wiped, but it does definitely mean that the medium howitzer is a weapon that you are taking to kill more models, rather than playing that economic game of attrition, and I would say it's not much of a hindrance overall. Still, it does sort of leave the medium howitzer in limbo between the light and heavy howitzer profiles, as the heavy howitzer is a weapon whose profile is upgraded dramatically in all fields, including pin markers, and for the most part, if players are looking to splurge on a howitzer, they will often spring for that heavy howitzer profile, as it just flat out is going to do everything better. Meanwhile, at the other end of the spectrum, the light howitzer is so inconsequentially cheap, and it isn't that much of a downgrade from the medium howitzer. But this is a topic that I will touch on again when we get to the final part of this video, when I discuss when and how I would use a medium howitzer. But before that, there is one last stat we have with the medium howitzer profile, and that is hits against buildings, something it definitely does have a huge upgrade on the light howitzer with, as the HE 3-inch template is going to give you 2d6 hits against targets and buildings. Meaning, you target a building, you roll to hit, and if you successfully hit that building, the unit you were targeting within it will then suffer 2d6 hits, and this HE explosion will ignore the -1 to wound that they would usually get for being inside a building. But most importantly here is the fact that you now have the ability to put 10 wounds onto a building, which would cause it to collapse, which of course will instantly kill all units inside it. So again, if you're not familiar with how buildings work in bolt action, if a high explosive weapon scores 10 hits against it in a single shot, which the medium howitzer is capable of doing with 2d6, then the explosion has been big enough to rubble the entire building, which is a very quick and nasty way to potentially insta-kill one or more units. But that is going to cap off the HE 3-inch profile, and move us along to the part where I do discuss how and when I would use a medium howitzer in a list. And first up here, I gotta say, one of the main reasons people take medium howitzers is due to accessibility. Like I said earlier, there are many scenarios in which people will always spring for the heavy howitzer over the medium howitzer, but unfortunately the heavy howitzer just is not that common of a unit, especially when it comes to putting these howitzers on vehicles. And honestly, if you are looking to spend the points on an upgraded howitzer profile, taking them on a vehicle is probably the best route. Once you start investing in those bigger guns, they become very high priority targets for your opponent, and simply running them as an artillery piece with 4 squishy wounds is going to make them a very popular target for things like mortars. And that's why earlier in this video I did recommend taking a spotter, as it is going to be advantageous to keep these larger, more expensive units out of your opponent's line of sight, and perhaps hiding them all together and using your spotters to draw line of sight. And that of course is going to be the scenario where I would recommend not taking a gun shield if you have the option to, and saving the 5 points. Though if your deployment allows for it, you can also make use of the very long range on these medium howitzers. Just make sure your opponent isn't going to have anything that can counter battery it, again like mortars or even other howitzers, and perhaps even deploy your howitzer last, to make sure you can deploy as far away from your enemy's units as possible. But from my overall experience, having a medium howitzer as an artillery piece just draws too much fire from your opponent, and they are a much better armament when equipped on vehicles, who most importantly are going to be maneuverable enough to avoid things like mortars, but will also for the most part be more durable. However, it is worth mentioning that most of the time when you see howitzers appear in that armored slot, they are going to be on self-propelled guns rather than actual tanks. And while these chassis do serve as a pretty good trade-off for that armament to armor points ratio, they are often on the fragile side and do require you to make use of range as you would with a standard artillery piece. So if you are a player who leans on that armored slot in a reinforced platoon to be the backbone unit of your force, you may want to avoid these self-propelled gun vehicles, which in many factions is the only time you see larger howitzers show up on armor. So overall, I'm not a huge fan of running medium howitzers as artillery pieces, as they do seem to be high-profile targets that get eliminated rather quickly, and while I do highly recommend running them on vehicles, not every faction has the ideal platform to do so, and if you do opt to run an SPG, you are going to need to compensate that lack of heavy armor elsewhere in your list. A good example of this would be running the German Vesp, which is an SPG sporting the medium howitzer alongside a Flak 88, which not only is a medium howitzer in of itself, but also a super heavy anti-tank gun that will prevent any cocky Shermans from running up and wiping that SPG off with one shot. But let me know what you guys think in the comments section down below. Do you think I'm being too hard on medium howitzers as artillery pieces? Personally, I have not had much luck with them, even when run in pairs in my Free French army. Meanwhile, my vehicle-mounted medium howitzers tend to do a whole lot better. But as always, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a like, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications, that way you won't miss any of these unit guides as they roll out. But until next time, take care.